Hey, good morning, everyone. It's so good to see so many people coming. As I was saying, I'm not at all surprised about it. In fact, today we have a fantastic guest. We have Professor Anu Bradford, who already was kind enough to share her thoughts and scholarship at the beginning of this week, but agreed also to talk more about her iconic book that is, and the broader idea behind it, that is the Brussels effect. It is, it is clearly personally, and I'm going to do a very short introduction because then I hope we have some sort of a possibility to discuss some of the idea. This book cast a light on an emerging element of power, I believe, more broadly, not just of the European Union, but in particular in the European Union, it essentially noted how the regulatory state or the development of the European version of the regulatory state and the administrative power can essentially have an impact that goes behind and extends behind the fields, I should say, that is meant to regulate and govern. So personally, I find the book extremely interesting and fascinating, also for the insight on what is power, mostly. And I will stop here because now it's much more interesting to hear about that from the author. And so I pass the word to Anu, who will speak for a bit, and then we have the possibility to have a commentator. Ying will actually provide some comments, and then we're going to open the discussion and hopefully tease out more information to that. Please.
Giuliano, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. I'm truly delighted and honored to be able to discuss the work that I really feel strongly about. That was one of the moments of my scholarly career where I felt that I was able to sort of find my voice on an issue that I really care about. So maybe I say a few words on why I wrote the book, The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. So the book is my attempt to respond to this conversation that portrays the European Union as increasingly irrelevant, that it is a declining economic power that has less and less ability to shape the state of the world. Because that is not the European Union that I observe daily in my teaching and research. So let me give you a few examples of what I mean that when I'm observing the European global influence. So if we think about the tech industry, some of the most powerful tech companies in the US, what do they do with respect to domains like data privacy? So companies like Meta or Google or Apple or Microsoft, they use the European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, as their global privacy policy. And if we think about then some companies like, again, Google's YouTube, or we think about Meta's Facebook, or we think about Twitter, now X, they don't use the American Constitution, its First Amendment's very expansive notion of free speech when they decide what content they take down from their platforms. They are using the European definition of hate speech, and not just in the EU, but outside of the EU as well. And it is not just the digital economy that is affected by European rules. The EU law also determines how timber is harvested in Indonesia, how and what kind of pesticides African farmers use on their farms, what kind of chemicals Japanese toy manufacturers use when producing toys, and what kind of facilities Chinese dairy factories install in those factories. So these are all examples how the European Union law is making its way across the global marketplace. And this is the phenomenon what I coined the term the Brussels effect. And if I give you a very short definition of the Brussels effect, I use it to describe the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. So the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. The US consumer market is wealthier, but it's smaller. The Chinese market is bigger, but it is less wealthy. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the market of 450 million wealthy consumers. So as the price for accessing that European market, these companies need to comply with European regulations. That's not surprising for any of us. But where it gets interesting is that often these companies decide to extend the European regulation to govern their global production or their global conduct because they want to avoid the cost of complying with different regulatory regimes. So you don't want to run necessarily multiple production lines and have a different product variety for each market in which you operate. So then the idea is that if you comply with the highest standard, which often is the EU standard, you have access to all the markets around the world. So if you follow this logic, all the EU needs to do is to regulate its own single market. It's then the global companies and their business interests that are extending those European regulations across the other markets within which they operate. So one way, and this is something that Giuliano said in the introduction, it is also trying to invite a conversation of what power means and what influence means. So the EU is not a military power. It is now in the desperate attempt to become a little bit more so after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The EU is not financial power the way that the US is, but it is a regulatory superpower. And I would contend that if you take law seriously, law can also be an element of power, because ultimately it affects all of us every day. So European regulations are affecting the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the products that we produce and consume. And to me, that is influence, a very tangible one. So let me say a few words on sort of motivations. Did the EU set out itself to rule the world? And this is not that there was some grand external strategy that the EU say that, okay, here we come, and we can talk all about regulatory imperialism in a moment. But the idea was that the EU was really laser focused on its primary goal, which was to create an integrated European single market. And the way to integrate that market was to pursue regulation. Because when you regulate, you are you're harmonizing the regulatory frameworks across the EU, and you facilitate then the trade across the member state borders. So the EU was really focusing on its internal goal, which is economic, which is political. But then it basically started hearing from global companies and saying, well, come on, guys, like you are actually regulating our market as well. And is this something that you are intending to do? And the EU kind of woke up to this idea that, well, actually, we have the power to influence the other markets as well. So over the last 10 years or so, I've seen that there's been more of a conscious use of regulatory power also as a tool for influence. That the primary motivation, the internal logic, has never disappeared. The EU is still very focused on building the single market, but it is also often now referring that we are setting the global standards. So if you look at the new digital regulations, for instance, the EU is kind of setting itself as a global example and sort of counting on the Brussels effect working in its favor. So let me now move to the question of whether this is a good or bad thing. So the book is a descriptive book. It basically does not criticize what the EU is doing, nor does it kind of celebrate and champion what the EU is doing. The main goal is to spell out a logic that I think is significant, and then I leave it for the reader to decide whether this is a good thing or bad thing. But ultimately, I think it is something that matters, it's something that is real, and my goal is to show why. But I think there are certain normative questions that the book asks and then briefly engages with. And those are some of the questions I would really love to hear from you, because I don't think there's necessarily one right way to think about them. But let me share with you, I think, 3 pertinent criticisms of the Brussels effect. So one is this idea that regulation is costly and it deters innovation. If you buy that narrative, the Brussels effect makes sure then that those costs are also higher in other markets, and we see less innovation in other parts of the world as well. So people don't always like regulation. I was recently introduced in a conference as a queen of regulation, and I don't think it was a compliment. So there's this idea that regulation just really prevents us from doing something really good for our economies. So there is this and I think it's possible. All regulation is not good. And too much regulation, misguided, misdirected regulation can definitely deter innovation. But I don't think that is often the case. There are many energy efficient technologies, for instance, that are good for the environment, but they also provide paths for greater economic gains. And in many ways, if you look at, for instance, how social media operates today, I am not sure if that is the kind of the pinnacle of innovation when we see all that hate speech and disinformation shaping the online discourse. So sometimes the regulation changes the paths of innovation and directs these companies towards different types of product and services. So I don't think that regulation always and necessarily deters innovation. So I am less convinced that the Brussels effect is necessarily a bad thing for that reason. There's another criticism that the EU regulation is protectionist. So all the EU regulations, for instance, the ones targeting the big American tech companies, it's just a manifestation of the European envy-driven attempt to try and level the playing field because they cannot compete themselves. So again, here, I have traditionally, and when writing the book, taken a rather kind of a strong view that the EU regulation is not motivated by protectionism. So if you think about, for instance, all those tech cases, all those antitrust cases against Google, Google has paid 10 billion in fines. Who initiated those cases? Who first went to the commission to complain? It was another American company, Microsoft. In many of these tech cases, there are US companies on both sides of the dispute. So this is the US companies fighting a civil war in the European territory because Washington does not give them the relief that they are seeking. So this is not that the Europeans are trying to protect some European search engine. There is no European search engine that is of any significance. When they go after Facebook, it's not that they're trying to protect a significant European competitor to Facebook. There is no significant European competitor to Facebook. It is often the other US companies that get the benefits if the Europeans intervene as well. A third potential criticism of the Brussels effect that, okay, here the Europeans go again. This is regulatory imperialism. This is what they do. They are, again, in their path to tell the rest of the world what is good for them, because it's also good for us in Europe. And I think there is a sort of criticism that is worth pausing to reflect, because the truth is that the way the Brussels effect operates, it does override the preferences of consumers in other markets. So if the Europeans really value data privacy, if they really value environmental protection, if they really value not having that many chemicals in the products that they use, foreign consumers may not make those trade-offs exactly the same way. They may say that, look, I rather want to have a cheaper product, and I can't afford to care about the environment as much. So in that sense, the European law is a challenge to the political autonomy and democracy in other countries and other governments' ability to basically provide the regulatory frameworks in accordance to their own domestic preferences. But here, though, I think I would say there's a couple of responses that the Europeans can have. So I think the most important one is that if the EU says that, look, all we are doing is regulating our own single market, which we have the sovereign right, even an obligation to do. If you then have a global multinational deciding to follow our chemical regulation when they are producing in Asia or in North America or in South America, that is their choice. That is their business decision. That is not our imperialism. There's also, I think, another somewhat more controversial criticism that one can say, especially when I speak to US audiences. I think it's fair for them to say it's controversial. But the idea is that, look, the Europeans sometimes say that, no, we're not a regulatory imperialist. We are a global benevolent hegemon. We are helping to solve the climate change, even though some other governments are not willing to do that. We are helping to rein in the tech giants because dysfunctional US Congress is not doing what their citizens expect from that Congress. And why don't they do? Because of the lobbying by tech companies. The US political process is so captured by business interests that I am not sure it is delivering the kind of outcome that in a healthy, more balanced democracy you would see in the United States. So the Brussels effect helps elevate also the interest of American citizens and consumers and sort of fight the corporate excess in the US. controversial argument, let me make it, and I will gladly engage on that one as well. But those are some of the sort of potential normative criticisms, how you can think about the Brussels effect, whether you should be concerned about it or whether you actually should be welcoming it. So maybe I say a few words on the future of the Brussels effect, and maybe a few sort of developments since I wrote the book a couple of years ago, where I believe this European regulatory power is going. So obviously, the question I often get is that, will it be eclipsed by the Beijing effect soon? So Europe is becoming less and less significant. China is rising in influence. Are we soon seeing the Chinese regulations actually then shape the global marketplace? And I am not trying to deny the sort of gravitational force of economic growth of China, the significance of that market, and the inevitable and certain relative decline of the EU share of the global GDP. So if you think about the sort of the Brussels effect relies on the significance of the European market. And the more it's shrinking, the easier it is for companies to say, okay, keep your market, I am going elsewhere. So here, for instance, I already got some questions when Meta decided not to launch its competitor to X, so Threads, in Europe, and said that, look, there are just too many regulations, so we're going to stay out of the European market. So I had people call me and say, is this the end of the Brussels effect? Like, are the tech companies now able to surpass the European market and the regulators? And you know, I think Threads never really took off, but I think there are a couple of reasons why make it ultimately very difficult for those companies successfully be global players and avoid the European market. So if I give you the Threads example. So first is that it would be easier if these social media companies could say that I don't care about doing business in Europe. There are many more internet users in China. But China remains closed from them. They cannot pick up users in China that they will forego in Europe because of the censorship regime. The second, they could probably say that, okay, what about India? There's like, how many users are there? These businesses rely on advertising as their model. And per user advertising revenue remains much higher in the developed and the more sort of established markets like the EU. So one Indian user is not as valuable still today for companies like Meta because they cannot extract the same advertising revenue. So forgoing the European consumer is still very costly for these companies. And the third reason is that the EU is no longer alone. And this takes me to the concept of de jure Brussels effect that I also talk about in the book, that not only the global companies are sort of inspired to or sort of driven because of the market conditions to adopt the EU law globally, but governments around the world are starting to emulate the regulations that the EU has in place. So we have many examples of governments in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, Australia, Canada, to basically emulate many of the EU regulations. So the more companies like Meta then faces EU-style regulations in other markets as well, the ability to then forgo the European market only to be facing similar restrictions elsewhere, that is shrinking. So even the US is now in many domains sort of reevaluating its commitment to this like market-driven idea that we cannot regulate our economy, and there's more pressures to regulate the environment, regulate the digital economy, and so forth. So in that sense, I don't think we necessarily see the extent of the sort of the end of the Brussels effect, because the rest of the world is also in some domains moving towards greater regulation, in part inspired by Brussels. So another reason why I don't think necessarily the Beijing effect will eclipse the Brussels effect anytime soon is that the GDP per capita is a much better predictor of the country's propensity to regulate than GDP alone. And it will take a while before the GDP per capita in China is at the level that the real appetite for regulating in a big way is there. That has been challenged to some extent recently with the tech regulations, that China actually has been building rather significant and ambitious regulatory capacity in some domain, but it still faces this idea that if it's promising to grow the economy and deliver those benefits to consumers, there may be limits where it actually needs to then pull back and decide like, look, we probably can't do this at the expense of the economic growth, especially when that growth is now challenged with many economic problems in the country. So I don't necessarily see that. We see also the Beijing effect. Also, the more close the Chinese market remains, the less it is going to have a global impact. So the reason the European digital regulations are spreading across the world is that it remains open for the US tech giants. And if these tech giants don't do business in Beijing, they don't care. They are not affected by rules that come from Beijing. So a couple of other sort of challenges to the Brussels effect. I want to mention there are potentially some students from the UK. So I want to mention Brexit very briefly. So there was this question that is Brexit actually really undermining the Brussels effect? And the EU lost a big chunk of its market share because Brexit no longer was part of the EU single market. So that obviously is a kind of strike against the Brussels effect. But the EU also lost regulatory capacity. I mean, the Brits were very good within the EU, and they have very competent bureaucrats drafting those rules and enforcing those rules. But the Brits didn't really like regulation. So now in many ways, the EU is going to be regulating even more because the Brits are not there around the table telling them to exercise a little bit more restraint. We have much more space for Franco-German preferences to prevail, and those governments like regulation. So we actually see more regulation. So what I rather see is not that the Brexit undermined the Brussels effect, but the Brussels effect has undermined Brexit. It is very difficult for UK businesses that continue to be geographically so close and so dependent on the access to the EU market to actually exercise their promised regulatory sovereignty. Because about half of the UK exports are still destined to the EU and they cannot evade the European rules. So what we see is when it comes to like chemical regulation, many other examples that the UK car manufacturers, for instance, do they then decide to produce their cars consistent with domestic UK regulations or consistent with the EU regulations when that EU market is 6 times bigger than their own domestic market? And many of them don't want to run a second production line for their domestic market only. So in many ways, it was a false promise of regulatory sovereignty that the UK pro-Brexit campaign was promising to the voters. And ultimately, the UK now finds itself living and being affected by even more regulated Europe because they have chosen to become a rule taker as opposed to rule maker in the EU. And personally, I don't think it's good for the UK, but it's also not good for the EU. I think the UK voice was a very important balancing factor in shaping the European regulations. So one thing what we may also see undermine the Brussels effect in the long run is the technological developments. If it becomes cheaper to produce customized products for different markets. You think about 3D printing. If you can really kind of locally print different variations, and it's no longer the question of scale economies or something that it would be very costly to do. So the tech companies are already pretty good at using the kind of geographically tailored policies, but often they just feel like, look, we might be able to base it based on the IP address and have a different sort of content moderation policy. But sometimes the business model is just makes it that very hard. So Facebook, for instance, they believe there's one global Facebook. And if they had a different content moderation policy for each user, depending where they are, there are no global conversation. You would be seeing part of the conversation that I wouldn't see, or the other way around. So it is very hard to have a truly global business model if you decide to have a balkanized regulatory policy for each of those domains. So I think some of those arguments that I outlined probably explain why the European regulatory power, to some extent, will outlive the power that would be just captured by the European GDP. So that's why I see that the Brussels effect will probably continue somewhat longer than what we otherwise would expect it to continue. And the new frontier of the Brussels effect is really in the domain of, I would say, there's a lot in the environmental protection that has been the sort of fighting climate change has been one priority of the EU, but also in digital regulation. So now there have been these major pieces of regulation that have come out of the EU. One is known Digital Markets Act, which is an ex-ante regulation of the leading digital gatekeepers that really forces changes in the big tech's business model. And then the Digital Services Act, that is more about content moderation, accountability, and transparency in that regard. So if I give you an example how we may see the Brussels effect manifest itself, is that I've talked a lot about Meta, so let me stay with that company, just a gift that keeps giving for somebody studying regulations targeting a company. So Meta, for instance, will be forced to forgo targeted advertising on minors. So you can no longer rely on targeted advertising with Instagram and Facebook when you you're dealing with the youth. It might be very hard, even if that regulation only applies to youth in Europe, for Meta to continue to exploit, for instance, American teenagers and tell that, look, we protect the European teenagers, but we are going to continue to do that in the US. So we're going to continue to exploit them in the US because regulators' expectations change, the users' expectations change, and global conversation about the direction of regulation changes. So I expect there to be also some degree of Brussels effect in AI Act, the AI regulation that will be finalized by the end of this calendar year. And I don't think there's going to be Brussels effect in sort of all the domains of AI regulation, but still, often the more data you have when you're training these AI models, the better the models perform. So if you are going to use the European data in training your models and you use those AI systems outside of Europe, you still need to be bound by the EU's AI Act. So you would need to carve out the European data and retrain your models with less data for other markets if you want to evade the protections of the EU's AI Act. So that is one reason why we are seeing a rather significant, potentially Brussels effect there as well. But rather than going on, I think I'll be really keen to hear your comments and the comments and questions from the audience. But thank you for the opportunity to discuss the book with you.
Thank you very much. I'm now passing the honor to comment and to our colleague Ying, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think this is a very interesting book and a very timely book, considering the how the unilateral rules diffuse the world and what factors explain such diffusion. And I think the book has a dense and solid case study of various aspects of policy diffusion, including competition, environmental protection, public health, data regulation, etc. And I think that it responds to not only the great power and politics shifts, but also the distinction between unilateralism and multilateralism and the geographical conflict, those ongoing debates as well. I have generally two comments on the book. The first is the pros and cons of market-driven harmonization. So the book defines market-driven harmonization of rules as compared to treaty-driven harmonization. And it distinguishes between a bottom-up diffusion through the global supply chains rather than a top-up diffusion through international treaty making. So my question would be, what's the pros and cons of a market-driven harmonization? So on the one hand, we do have some areas that is really hard to achieve multilateralism in this aspect, but we do need international cooperation, such as climate change, right? But a unilateral action might also has its problems, as it may create conflict of laws between countries, and the companies may suffer from such conflict of laws. So there are some conflict of laws that can be solved by private international law rules. But nowadays, many conflict laws are deliberately made between countries. For example, economic sanctions. So if a company today would like to comply with the United States economic sanctions law, it may violate the blocking statutes of the EU. And if it wants to comply with the EU blocking statutes, it may, on the other hand, violate the United States sanctions law. So actually, many companies now today fall into a dilemma. And they are confused whether I should comply or not comply with a law in a specific jurisdiction. So I'm wondering, like, how can we solve those conflict of laws resulting from unilateral regulatory globalization as defined in this book? And my second comment is about the reasons that can explain policy diffusion or ego transplant. So the book mentions 5 elements that contribute to the Brussels effect, including market size, regulatory capacity, stringent standards, inelastic targets, and non-divisibility. So I'm thinking whether there are more factors that can contribute to policy diffusion. For example, today we can see many policy innovations in different parts of the world, and many of them are not initiated by state parties, but by non-state entities such as companies or NGOs. And many different reasons can explain policy diffusion across the globe. For example, you have coercion between imbalanced powers. You have cooperation by willing state parties through treaty making. You also have competition between countries, for example, the race to the bottom phenomenon under environmental law. And we also see many learning and emulation practice in state legislation. But besides that, we can also see many innovations and diffusions by non-state parties. So in this case, we might not only have Brussels effects or Beijing effects or Washington effects, but we also have, for example, Google effects, Meta effects, or TikTok effects. So what I'm thinking whether the Brussels effect can be generalized to other areas of policy diffusion. Okay, so those are my 2 comments. It's a very interesting book. Thank you.
Professor Bradford, please.
So thank you so much. A very, very thoughtful questions. So let me maybe say, I think the pros and cons of doing this unilaterally versus then doing it, for instance, multilaterally. So sometimes I think we live in the second best world, that the Europeans would be quite willing to recognize that there's no value in that they want to do things unilaterally. The European Union is a construct of multilateralism itself, and it's very committed to multilateral cooperation. And it would be one of the first there always to lead if there's an international effort to address climate change and so forth. So the Europeans don't see that we want to do this unilaterally. We don't want to engage, but it's more like the cooperation is very hard these days. International institutions are quite weak. And then the Europeans have the option of either kind of not getting anything done internationally, or then saying, well, we at least then go on our own and we regulate, even if there's no global AI treaty, no global binding, really forceful climate change treaty, no sort of international agreements on which chemicals we for instance, prohibit. So we're going to do it in Europe. And that sort of explains their regulatory leadership. But I think as soon as, for instance, if we look at some areas of the Europeans, we're going ahead with digital taxation of these tech giants, but then engage in the OECD's effort to find global cooperation. So sometimes the European unilateralism is kind of forcing the other countries to the negotiation table and say that, well, you're going to do it anyway, so why don't we rather do this together? It also happened when the Europeans were trying to extend the emissions trading scheme to aviation, to say that, okay, any flight that takes off from Europe or lands in Europe needs to be subject to the European emission trading. So, and you would do it for the entire distance. So you would fly from Hong Kong to a place in, let's say, Brussels, and you would be paying for those emissions. And that was kind of a very sort of strong attempt to extend the European regulatory regime. And ultimately, that's when the Europeans got a lot of pushback, when many countries said that, look, this is just going too far, and ultimately sort of threatened that we're not going to buy Airbus planes, like some of the biggest, including Chinese airlines, say that you're going too far. And the Europeans kind of like pull back and say that we are not going to extend this, but that triggered international negotiations on aviation and emissions. So there was kind of an impetus, which I think goes a little bit to your second questions on policy diffusion and other ways for diffusing with the norms, diffusion of norms. Sometimes there's a sequence whereby unilateralism then triggers an impetus for multilateralism, and we would see that to happen. So to me, I never sort of say that unilateralism is the best or the only way. and it still kind of coexists with other forms of policy diffusion. And I think the Europeans are very engaged, for instance, in international standard setting, where they are playing to their strengths as a sort of multilateral player that is doing it often better than the US in many of those multilateral negotiation settings. So let me say one more thing on the conflict of laws, because I think sometimes the Brussels effect resolves those conflicts in Europe's favor. So if you have a jurisdiction that doesn't really care about environmental protection at the same time, at the same level, there are very few jurisdictions that would really present a true conflict of laws that would tell you to pollute and you are like obligated to emit greenhouse gas emissions. So if the regulatory standard is lower, you basically avoid the conflict just by complying with the highest standard. But then there have been few instances where the companies cannot just follow the EU rule and be in compliance everywhere. So one example, I don't know whether this has changed since my writing in China, but when it comes to cosmetics, so chemical regulation, the Europeans banned the testing of those cosmetics on animals. And at that time, the Chinese law required animal testing before you can safely release the cosmetics on the market. So you cannot at the same time test and not test on animals. So you basically need to have a different set of testing done for the cosmetics that you offer for the European market, but then you either don't offer them in China, or then you set up a different testing regime and basically have a second production line. The same thing that happened, there was a very famous WTO dispute on this. The Europeans don't really like the idea that you treat chicken with chlorine. Americans want you to treat the chicken with chlorine so that it's considered safe for the US market. So there were a lot of, that's another instance where the regulations are not just kind of a somewhat like less demanding and more demanding, and by choosing the more demanding regulation, the Brussels effect wins. Basically, the European rule wins. You cannot at the same time treat and not treat your chicken with chlorine. So sometimes you have like true regulatory conflicts, and those are the domains which then spill onto trade disputes or lead sometimes the farmers to choose that they only export to certain market, but not to another market. But that was a really rich set of comments and questions, and I really appreciate that. So let me end there.
Thank you very much. Well, I now open the floor. If there is any question, comment, that's your chance, please.
I was wondering about enforcement. As you know, data privacy has enforcement outside the EU. I was wondering, how is that going? Because there's also shopping for regulators or and jurisdiction for enforcements in European Union. So I was wondering, how strong is the Brussels effect with regards to enforcement? Because you can have rules of all you like. If enforcement is patchy and weak or even contradictory, it's just symbolism. So I was wondering if you can comment on that. Thank you.
It's a very pertinent question. Europeans are much better at promulgating laws than enforcing those laws. And I think that's one thing that can, in the long term, dilute the deterrent effect of the Brussels effect. And also then sort of pose the question for the companies, do they really need to worry about it if they just have the rules in books, but they are not really sort of affecting their conduct? So I think the Europeans are aware, for instance, of the enforcement deficit of the GDPR, and we've now seen a move towards much bigger fines in the GDPR, but also actually bans of the way, for instance, that Facebook can or cannot seek consent. And the idea that that you would need to, for instance, separately ask the user if they would consent to you combining the data from different sort of apps where you are collecting the data when you're operating in that same ecosystem. So I think the Europeans are trying to move towards more robust enforcement framework. And that, I think, is also leading to much more sort of unease among the tech companies. So those who have followed the digital regulatory space, two major regulations were passed last year. Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, the ones that I mentioned briefly, is the kind of the new frontier of the Brussels effect. Those are not just content with fines, because the fines by these tech companies were treated as a price for doing business. We just pay them and then we go on and continue business as usual. but they are actually forcing real changes to how these companies operate. So Apple is forced to allow other app stores within App Store, that you don't only have the Apple's tight own ecosystem. Google is forced to, when you open your Android phone, you don't have a default, Chrome, you don't have the default Google search engine. They need to offer you a choice, the menu, and you will choose which browser you have. That's much more dangerous for Google. The same way that I mentioned the ban on targeted advertising. I mean, this is changing the way they do business. That's a massive hit for the company. But up until now, I'm completely in agreement with you that, for instance, for GDPR, Apple's own decision to ask the users if they don't want to be tracked was a more powerful blow for Facebook than the GDPR ever was. But I think we all now watching very carefully whether this new frontier in enforcement strategy that is really sort of trying to go get at the business models will make a difference, and actually then allow the Europeans to show that we're not just passing the laws, we're actually entrenching them into concrete market outcomes.
Thank you. Jed.
Great. So one curiosity and one challenge. On the curiosity, so you lay this out descriptively. People may have some sort of normative critique of it, but what do they actually expect anyone to do, right? So you mentioned in the book, and I've heard these things, I'm from California, right? So this is discussed, it's an active issue right now. The only thing people's been able to come up with is try to make it unconstitutional, right? For California to pass laws that have the same type of market-driven impact on the US without some sort of constitutional mechanism. What do people then link their normative critiques to? It's just simply that the EU shouldn't do this. It's a suasive argument that doesn't, it seems like all the things you're talking about are other market reactions, and it seems difficult to avoid this.
Yeah.
The second question then is like, does this really sort of energize an idea of the EU not as a declining state? I sort of am sympathetic on sort of the innovation and regulatory side, but isn't something about the EU project itself limit this type of power, right? So if you're interested in labor issues, here's one area where the Brussels effect seems to be quite weak, right? Exporting, you mentioned like the digital tax. So on like really core infrastructural issues, right? Tax, labor, much weaker. Consumer issues, I'm very happy that I'll have a USB-C for my iPhone in the future, but it would seem the Brussels effect is really limited to those sort of consumer adjacent areas, and even on the environmental side, right? So it seems like because the EU conceptualizes itself as like a single market, but a certain type of regulatory market, it doesn't touch on some of these infrastructural issues where that would really be where a demonstration of power would happen. Some of these other things are sort of, impactful, but ultimately limited by that sort of conceptualization of regulation at the heart of the EU itself.
Yeah. So very, very good. Thank you, Jed. So what can you do? Very little. That's just one thing. What I said, it was at the height of the Trump presidency. He can walk away. He was able to walk away from World Health Organization, from the WTO dispute settlement, the appellate body. He was able to generally walk away from the big trade agreements like the TPP. He couldn't walk away from the Brussels effect. So it's not a political, it's sort of sustained by market forces. And even if he really loosened the US environmental regulations, chemical regulations, and say like, look, have asbestos, I don't care. The companies exporting to Europe could not start adding asbestos into their products. They said, we're going to do globally what we need to do in Europe. So in many ways, I think it's a limited ability because it's not a negotiated solution to what you can do. I think one thing that the US could have done is to just really pursue much more closer cooperation with the EU and say, well, let's set these standards jointly. And I think that has been now done to some extent with this Trade and Technology Council. The US is trying to have more of a regulatory dialogue on some of these issues. It was almost absent during the Trump administration. So ultimately, it's very hard to undermine. That's why I think what makes it so pertinent is that it's not costly to use. You just basically pass regulations. You don't need a lot of budget for that. It's the enforcement is done, compliance by companies, enforcement by member state agencies. But it's a much less sort of politically contested way of leveraging influence, and it's harder to counter. Whether ultimately it's still limited, and I absolutely think it is limited. There are many domains where, there's nothing that the EU can do with its regulatory power to persuade Russia to, walk away from Ukraine. There's still many other dimensions of power that matter. But even if we think about sort of regulatory power, the elements of the Brussels effect, the 5 criteria that Ying really helpfully detailed here, the second element is regulatory capacity. And where the EU doesn't have competence, and it doesn't have across all the domains, there is no Brussels effect. And it's limited in labor, it's limited in taxation, exactly the ones that you mentioned. So what it relies on is this idea that we actually have seen year after year, the EU never loses competence, but it's gaining more competencies, especially with all the crises. So right now after COVID, health policy wasn't an EU matter. Now we are working on a health union. So the EU is gradually through the crisis getting more and more competence, which then allows it to sort of expand its sphere of regulation. But you're absolutely right. There are limits to what the EU can do in the domains that remain in the orbit of member state competence.
So I'm so glad that you have shared the latest thoughts about the Brussels effect, for example, in relation to the Beijing effect people have been talking about. So I have a specific question about the relationship between the Brussels effect and Beijing effect. So it's so interesting that China actually has been following the Brussels effect. For example, China, modeled its personal information protection law after GDPR. Many provisions are basically, copied from GDPR. So can we say that this is a very the expansion of Brussels effect in a country like China? But then. On the other side, I can see that while China is following or copying, but at the same time, it also attempts to compete with the regulatory authorities that European Union tries to have at the global stage. For example, in terms of regulating AI, China actually started very fast, early in March or April this year. It simply published its latest regulation on generative AI system, one of its kind in the world.
Yeah.
So I can see that this is complicated, copying from Europe, and at the same time, competing with Europe, trying to gain the authority in a global stage. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts about this unique chemistry between the two effects. Yeah. My second question, I'll be very quick, is about targeted advertising you mentioned earlier. The EU's court's decision are actually quite widespread. Last night, we actually talked about, in my class, we talked about how courts have made decisions, broadly against Meta, ruling that targeted advertising is in general illegal under GDPR, unless Meta provides like opt-out opportunities for users in Europe. So that, as you said, that will deal a big blow to the business operation of Meta and many other big tech companies in Europe. So I wonder whether the Brussels effect like that will actually eventually drive tech companies to operate business in Europe. Not completely, but some sort of, a certain degree of withdrawal or, shrink their business operation. And so this is in relation to your previous explanation on why there are no big tech companies in Europe. Is it because of the Brussels effect? But I wonder, as a practical matter, that will actually, deeply affect, big tech and its operation in Europe.
Great, thank you, Hajan. So it's interesting how China has been affected by this de jure Brussels effect. To some extent, less by de facto Brussels effect, because Chinese tech giants now outside of TikTok are not as big in Europe. So they're not as international as American tech companies. So they're very big in China, but TikTok is kind of an exception to many of these tech giants that have a massive market share that is domestic, but they don't have the same kind of international cloud compared to the internationalization of the US firms. But this de jure Brussels effect, China clearly follows closely what the Europeans are doing, whether it's in antitrust, but also if you look at the PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law, it's very similar in many dimensions, but then there are the kind of state-driven Chinese characteristics. So it's similar in many ways how it prevents the companies from exploiting the data of the consumers. But then it does not follow the European script when it comes to what are the citizens' rights vis-a-vis the state. So state has more access to information, and it's even explicitly contemplates then the mass surveillance that is prohibited under European law. So I think it sort of shows how China is affected by the Brussels effect and EU rules, but it's then selective in making sure that the rules fit the political system of the country. But yeah, there's also regulatory competition, and the EU can never beat China in speed. Democracy slows the EU down. It is much harder to have the EU's legislative process that would turn around quite as fast as the Chinese regulatory framework does. At the same time, I think there's some value with the deliberation that goes into the EU lawmaking, that goes through the hurdles of having the 3 major EU-level institutions that need to sign on of that, and 27 member states that are often differing in their views on that. So the laws that sort of survive that process, they are rather balanced, which also means they often are by design meant to work in different jurisdictions that are heterogeneous. So the EU law is then easier to transplant in many parts of the world because of this kind of a heterogeneity that was part of the explicit part of the lawmaking. There's also a very pragmatic advantage that the EU has, is that its influence in parts of Africa and Latin America is much greater than China's ever will because of language. So the EU laws exist in Spanish, in Portuguese, in French, and they're very easy to copy as they are, because all the court decisions also exist in those languages, and you have the whole kind of bureaucratic apparatus that can be more readily used in the languages that these countries operate. And that, I think, it's not going to be then the case with the kind of the advantage of Chinese law. But I am very well aware that China, for instance, is taking a lead. I'm kind of need to go and revisit a little bit my earlier discussion that the EU has had the regulatory capacity, which Beijing hasn't had. Beijing is building it very fast. The question is, how much can it leverage it for also sort of internationalization of any of those Chinese laws? But I talk, and this goes back to my other book, is that there's still another type of Beijing effect, the Beijing effect that travels through the building of the digital Silk Road. So there are other ways to also export Chinese regulations. China is also becoming more influential over international standard setting in standard setting organizations. So I am not sort of writing off the growing influence of China, but I'm rather pointing out that the channels and mechanisms and processes follow a different logic than the Brussels effect.
Please.
So my question will relate to the enforcement at the enforcement level and the strengths of the personal effect in data and high tech regulations like AI. So, for example, the EU AI Act has, as I mentioned earlier, very frequent references to technical specifications. Yeah. And the GDPR relies its authority on the dichotomy of data and non-personal data, which again would goes to what types of privacy enhancing technologies you use, what type of anonymization technologies you use, and it all goes down to the technical specification, technical standards. And I was thinking that even if other countries adopt laws like GDPR or like the EU AI Act, the enforcement of these laws in each jurisdictions, well, at the end of the day, depends on, the technical specifications they enact in their own jurisdictions. And for example, China, indeed, its PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Act, resembles very like the GDPR, but it's, how it has been enforced and the concept of personal information, privacy differs greatly from the EU. And so I was wondering, how do you feel about the strengths of the Brussels effect in the high-tech regulation era? So that's my question.
So very good. And I think it's very likely that, and sort of very correct observation that the Brussels effect is really so complete that the countries, for instance, the de jure Brussels effect would adopt the EU law exactly as it is. It sometimes happens, especially with countries that don't have any capacity, that they basically just copy the laws because it's just too much manpower to try to sort of tailor the laws to their own needs, and they may just even follow the technical specifications. This is what the EU does. This is what we're trying to do, but it sometimes still leads to lesser enforcement because they cannot replicate what the EU is even struggling sometimes to do. So, but especially then when it comes to larger economies that have their own standard setting, that have more of all, then they that have their own values that sort of lead them to, by design, sort of tailor the aspects of the EU law that suits better their own sort of jurisdictions, values, and other attributes. We see more sort of a variant of the Brussels effect. So we rarely see it as in a complete way. So, but even in countries that are pretty closely aligned in how they think about tech regulation, like Australia, we often see them say that this is where we follow exactly the GDPR, for instance, or content moderation. This is where we make a somewhat of a departure. So I think technical standards may be one manifestation how the sort of different sort of level of the regulation embedded in the regulation still leads to some differences in practice. But I think it's still significant when the GDPR has sort of reset our expectations about privacy, brought it to the forefront of the regulators, provided a template for privacy advocates to say that, look, we also need to do this at home, even though then we will end up having different sort of implementations exactly on the specifics. It still has contributed to that there is greater privacy protection in markets like China.
Building on that, actually, I take advantage of having the mic in front of me. And so I think it also depends on how we want to assess, if we need to assess, what is the Brussels effect and the Beijing effect. Because ultimately, as if I understood correctly, and also as you were articulating, the point is that the first mover in setting new rules, as we can see for AI or data, is essentially setting the tone for the entire discussion. So ultimately, whichever jurisdiction is going to implement, in the case of, for instance, in this case of data governance, is going to implement some sort of privacy rule or data governance rules, it's confronted with the question whether to align the part or find some sort of middle ground with what other jurisdictions have applied, and being the first mover, notably the GDPR. This, you can see that in the process of law reforms, where even when there are international standards like Basel or every policymaker ultimately asks, show me a jurisdiction where these things have been correctly implemented and how they have done that. And where do you go? For the reason you just illustrated, you essentially go to the European Union, because there are several rules that are aligned with international standards, but they are implemented correctly or non-correctly, whatever that means, but they are systematized, organized, similarly to what might have been probably the UCC effect or the Sherman Act. So my question here is then, should we, how can we assess? It might be just an academic exercise, but I don't know if there is a policy implication, the Brussels effect. Shall we look at the enforcement? Shall we look at the, and probably this goes back to the definition of power you were starting with.
So I think sort of measuring the effect it's very tricky. This is not it's a theory piece and not an empirical piece. And I've often been asked, so like, what is the magnitude of the Brussels effect? And then I think this conversation has made it clear. We can look at what is the sort of magnitude of the Brussels effect in actually having impact versus then actually having sort of how do you measure whether it has shaped the public discourse and expectations and legislative practices. I've been really delighted to see that there now have been empiricists testing the Brussels effect. So there's now something I've seen around 10 papers where the sort of legal scholars or the economists or political scientists have been measuring, and they have found in many instances sort of evidence of the companies changing their policies outside of the EU in response, for instance, to the GDPR. That's normally the domain where the Brussels effect has been measured most extensively. But I think you also raised the issue that was raised by Jed and the others that sometimes, yes, we see a policy change, but then to think about, like you think about statistical significance and you also think about sort of economic significance, like how significant that is in practice and sort of whether it will get there at some point. So I think the measurement question is obviously something that all of us, what is it that you care about? Do you actually care about that? If we care about laws being passed around the world, as lawyers, we do need to attribute significance that there are laws that resemble the GDPR, whether they are effectively enforced or not. I think it's still a significant example of diffusion that changes the behavior of legislators, which is something that I think is often the precondition for further changes in those jurisdictions as well. It seems to be that it's a while before there's a lag between the EU legislate and before it has figured out how to enforce. And I think we're about to see a big shift towards a much more drastic attempt to regulate, for instance, tech companies. But I wouldn't say, I think there's a lot of sort of discussion how law is imperfectly enforced. I think that's normally the case in many jurisdictions and in many domains of law. It doesn't mean that the law is insignificant. And I think the Brussels effect and the EU regulations were meant to do more, but I think they have done a lot. And it's hard for me to, for instance, measure what would be the level of privacy we would observe in the world and in the behavior of these tech companies if there had not been the GDPR. I would say we have more privacy today. How much hate speech we would have online if there were no rules whatsoever, I think we would have much more. Do we have the optimal level of enforcement today? I don't think we do. But I think we are probably, the question is, what's your benchmark? Is it some idealistic where we ought to be? And I think it's a broader question, no matter what area of law you study, in terms of like where the law is falling short on creating the society that law was designed to create.
Thank you very much. On that note, I think I'm asking you to join me to thank Professor Bradford. And that was very interesting. And we hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Thank you
so much. Thank you.